You know, one of the things that I love about this part of the story up here is that on one hand there's this sense of unity, the unity of creation that God created in these origin stories, and yet there's an incredible sense of diversity. You know, one of the bits I love about it is where God says to Adam, "I want you to go and name all of the animals." There's great songs about that. So God created animals, God created trees, God created, but there's incredible diversity in that creation. There's different types, there's different colours, there's different, you know, everything, flavours in a sense. There's incredible diversity within creation. Now, today we're talking about what it means to be human, and we're talking about children as whole beings. They are whole, and yet, just like all of creation, they are incredibly diverse. One child is not the same as another child. There are similarities, there's a sense of unity, but there's this incredible sense of diversity. And we're going to look at that. We're going to look at that idea of diversity and wholeness all together into one package, in a sense. There's a number of things we're going to do this week, but I'm just going to start off with this brief comment. And I've decided that I'm going to take one of these characters that we drew up here previously. I don't remember if you remember who this is, but this was Ruth. The story of Ruth, which you'll find in the Old Testament. And I want us to just take Ruth as an example and look at her as a whole being. Now, she's not a child in the story. She's a young adult probably, but certainly she would have been a child. And child or adult, it doesn't matter. The same applies. We'll come back to children in a minute. So let's just take Ruth, and I'm just going to draw a picture of her here. And I want to put up here a number of dimensions of what it means to be human. So let me just write those up. So there's a bunch of words. They're words that describe dimensions of what it means to be human. You know, we are all physical beings. There is a psychological dimension to us. There is an emotional dimension to us. There's a cognitive or thinking dimension. Cognitive has to do with brain and brain function, that we think. There's a social dimension to us. We relate to people. We love. We communicate, and all of those things that we do socially. There's a moral dimension to us, a moral compass, how we work out what's right and what's wrong, and so on and so forth. And of course, there's a spiritual dimension to us. One of the temptations with children's ministry or ministry with children is to think that we're only concerned with the spiritual, when in actual fact, you just can't take any one of these out and separate it as easily as that. The spiritual dimension of a human being, the spiritual dimension of Ruth here, it's affected by, it's influenced by, and it feeds into other aspects of Ruth and Ruth's being. When we're working, well, sorry, just to go back to Ruth, you know, you could read Ruth's story. It's not a long story, actually. It'd be a great thing to do, you know, with a cup of coffee in the morning and just sit down and read the whole thing through. And that's maybe a challenge for you, is sit and read Ruth's story, which has a number of characters in it. There's Ruth, there's a mum, there's Boaz, there's a baby eventually, and various other sub characters in that story. But when you read Ruth's story and you say have this kind of list in front of you, as you read the story, you'll be able to see these different aspects of Ruth's being operating at different points in the story, but not operating independently. They're operating as an integrated unit, in a sense. See, children, humans, are integrated beings. And to think about ministry with children, you need to think about the whole being, not just one aspect of it. Though we might focus on one aspect from time to time. coming back to this idea of creation and wholeness, integration, unity, diversity. When that became broken in this part of the story, the story of the fall, as we've said before, God's mission through history has been to restore that shalom, that as it's meant to be kind of world that God created. So we need to think about God's restoration as including all of these dimensions of what it means to be human. When you're engaging with children in ministry, you need to be not just thinking of the spiritual dimension, but of all dimensions, because they are connected together. And if you leave any of them out, if you neglect any of them, then the others will suffer. These are not just dimensions of what it means to be human, but these are also needs that we have. They're care needs. When you're working with children and you're thinking about how do I care for this child, you need to be caring for them in all of these ways. If you only focused on the spiritual and you neglected these other areas of care, that would be pretty neglectful. You need to think about them in an integrated kind of way. So, children as whole beings, think about that list as dimensions of what it means to be human. Now, this week, in addition to thinking about that, you're going to be looking specifically at, I'm just making sure I'm covering everything I want to cover here. We're going to get you to look at, read a few chapters of a book by a lady called Ivy Beckwith. This is the book here, Postmodern Children's Ministry, Ministry to Children in the 21st Century. Now, there's some great stuff in this book. Beckwith is an American. She's writing to an American audience, and you're going to have to do some cultural translation as you read this, coming from a different context. And even within your own culture, we're made up of multiple cultures as well. So if you're coming from an Asian background, or if you're coming from an African background, you're going to need to do some cultural translation also in terms of what Beckwith's saying. But Beckwith is picking up on a couple of theorists, social scientists, who, one of them, a guy called Erik Erikson, he looks at two dimensions here. Erikson looks at the social and the psychological dimension. He connects them together. So we use the phrase psychosocial. Erikson will look at the psychosocial dimension of humanness. Beckwith picks up on Erikson's work and relates it to ministry with children. So you'll get a sense of child development, particularly from a psychosocial perspective, as you read Beckwith, and she takes you through that. The other theorist that she picks up on is a guy by the name of James Fowler. And James Fowler particularly thinks through faith formation, the stages of faith formation. He's another social scientist. So she combines Erikson and Fowler's work together, and she will take you through some of these stage type, the development of children and the stages of the development. She'll take you through some of that, and you'll cover the first half of childhood and the second half of childhood in the couple of chapters you're going to read. We've also put in the resources for you this time. There's a number of short papers and a few tables. One table looks at these dimensions. There's another table in there that looks at developmental stages, not just the psychosocial, but also the physical and all the other dimensions of child development. And it will look at it from the perspective of different ages, because one of the key things to remember when you're thinking about people as whole beings, and particularly children, is that a 6-month-old is completely different from a 2-year-old, and a 2-year-old is completely different from a 7-year-old, and a 7-year-old is completely different from a 12-year-old. They are at different stages. They react and respond in different ways, and it's really important that you get a sense of this. Okay, so we've provided enough resources in there for you to have a look at. We hope they're not overwhelming, but we hope they help you gain a sense of diversity in childhood and wholeness in childhood, and set you up as we move next week and in other weeks to pick up on other topics. This is another foundational area we want you to comprehend, and that is that children are whole beings. Also, just to say to you that the tasks that you'll do this week, apart from your readings, we want you to do some observation. So we want you to take some of these ideas, particularly these ones here, and we want you to observe a child or a group of children and to look at how you're seeing these things playing out in the lives of those children, in the behaviour and the interactions of those children. So there's an exercise there that we've given you as well, and you can record that in your learning diary, and you can share some of those things on the forum, but the instructions are there online for you to look at as well.